Less than an hour from now, Greek parliamentarians are set to vote on a savage set of budget cuts and radical measures to raise revenue. If they pass, the country likely will receive a second bailout from the EU and the IMF. If they don't, Greece may have no choice but to default on its national debt. With us this morning, Bill White. He chairs the Economic and Development Review Committee at the OECD. Bill is in Basel, Switzerland. Bill, good morning to you. I know you're optimistic. I know you think Greek parliamentarians will follow through on what Prime Minister George Papandreou has said is their national duty and their patriotic duty and pass these measures. What if they don't?
Well, if they don't, I suggest that the Europeans will find some other way to provide temporary financing in the hope that they'll manage to get the parliamentary support a little bit further down the line. I think the idea that there would be a sudden default at this juncture, I find that pretty hard to envisage, frankly.
Okay, so what would the other way be, Bill? What would the other way be? What could they do? What could what could the EU officials, what could the IMF officials do? This is something we really haven't talked a lot about, a plan B.
Well, I haven't thought about this a very great deal, but there is money available potentially in the European financial mechanism. There is the possibility of bilateral support. These kinds of things were talked about in the case of Portugal. You remember where there was concern that the government could not get its act together. In the end, of course, the Portuguese came through. So there are things I think that could be done. Now, you may well say desperate circumstances call for desperate measures, but the sums of money involved are not, in fact, very large. So I'm sure that something would be cobbled together to allow us more sober reflection on what ought to be done here going forward.
Bill, ultimately, is this really good for Greece? We know that it's good in the sense that the Eurozone will remain intact, but do you really believe Greece will be able to repay these debts?
Well, you know, the bad news is that there's so much that needs to be done in Greece, or that could be done. The good news is that there's so much that's bad in Greece that could be done. So you start thinking about things, for example, like they've got the lowest rate of labor force participation in Europe. They've got the most heavily regulated economy in Europe. They've got huge government assets that are very badly managed at the moment, much more than anywhere else in Europe. The informal economy is the biggest informal economy as a share in Europe. So there's lots of low-hanging fruit here. And the honest truth is that the Greeks, in the course of last year and this year, have taken pretty close to 18% of GDP out of the economy in terms of fiscal discipline, both expenditure increases and tax cuts. No one has ever done anything of this magnitude before.
You raise a very good point.
The question at issue is,
you raise a very good point, which is the Greeks have tightened their belts to an extraordinary degree already and failed to meet the targets that were set in the first bailout. So even if there is all of this low-hanging fruit, how could they possibly meet a stricter set of targets conditioned on the second bailout?
Well, look, we've got to be clear here about why they missed the target. For a starter, there was a revision to the 2009 deficit upwards by 2 percentage points of GDP, which sort of came after the original targets were set. So they've missed it by about, having taken out, as I say, let's say 12% of GDP over the course of the last 2 years, they missed the target by 1/2 of 1%. So I guess the question is this bottle half empty or is this bottle half full? I think the bottle is half full. The real remaining question is whether they can maintain the program that they've laid out for themselves through to 2015, get the primary surplus up to, I think, of the order of 5 or 6%, and keep it there. And if they can do that, and if they can bring in structural reforms, which they're certainly proposing to do, the legislation is already out there, they can get the asset sales organized properly, which they have the intention of doing. All of this is doable. Now, having said that, there's a lot of risks along the way that have got to be taken into account as well. To the optimist, what that means is it makes it even more imperative that the Greeks do what they say they're going to do. Otherwise, those risks are likely to be triggered, and then we have a problem.
Indeed. Bill, it is a tall order facing Greece. We appreciate your perspective. An optimistic Bill White, one of the top executives at the OECD.